All right, my next question is from YouTube. I think this was last week. And if it's not, I'm just putting your YouTube names up there. So if it's not vulgar, I'm posting it. And some of your guys' names are hilarious. So this is from Redneck Patriot. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 11, was that talking about Christ's spirit that came upon the prophets? Or how do you, that's his question. I know where he's going with that, is how does an Old Testament person have the Spirit of Christ?
Right. This is what it says. Of this salvation, this is verse 10, the prophets have inquired and searched carefully who prophesied of the grace that would come to you, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ who was in them was indicated when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. And so the passage is pretty straightforward, man. It says it's the Spirit of Christ. And so, yeah, that's what it says.
So would you discern like the Old Testament prophets being different than we are as far as having the Holy Spirit? Like how do you discern the difference between Christ living in us,
right,
and that verse of what they were dealing with? Or is it the same?
It is not the same. The New Testament, in New Testament times, we have the Spirit of God dwelling within us. By the way, this is one of those passages that's a Trinitarian passage, because when you're talking about the Spirit being inside the prophets, speaking to them about things that are to come, obviously it's the Spirit of God, and in this passage, Peter calls it the Spirit of Christ. And so, whose Spirit is it? And the answer is both. And so, when you're talking about the Trinity, you have passages that interchangeably use the Father and Jesus in passages to indicate something that has to do with the Godhead. And so this is another one of those passages. So in the Old Testament, the Spirit of God would come upon people, and it was to empower them, and in this case, to give them wisdom to prophesy. Specifically, the passage here says, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ who was in them was indicating when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. And so what you have in this passage is a passage telling you that it was God's Spirit that was telling them the things that were going to come. And in this case, again, it's the Spirit of Christ. So the difference between an Old Testament believer and a New Testament believer is that Old Testament believers would have the Holy Spirit come upon them and empower them to prophesy and to anoint them as kings. Samson's a good example of that. When the Spirit of God would come upon him, he'd rip gates off of walls and city walls and carry them 10 miles, that kind of thing. And so you have that. But the Bible doesn't teach that the Spirit of God lived inside of them. And so God was empowering them, but not living in them. And where God dwelt in the Old Testament is in the temple. And so that's where he localized his presence. And you see the cloud, or the Shekinah glory of God that was dwelling between the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant. And so that's how that's pictured. When you get to the New Testament, you have the Spirit of God dwelling inside of believers. And so specifically in John chapter 20, you have a situation there where Jesus appears to the apostles and he breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit. And then in Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit comes upon them for power. And so I think that when Jesus breathed on the disciples in John chapter 20, they received the Holy Spirit. And then what that is the indwelling. That's where God comes to live inside of you. And then later on in Acts chapter 2, you have the Holy Spirit coming upon them. And that's for power. Acts chapter 2 is like the Old Testament. John chapter 20 is something that's brand new. And so that's how a person gets saved today. So again, this is one of those situations where the Holy Spirit was working in these prophets, telling them the future, and Peter identifies the Holy Spirit in the prophets as being the Spirit of Christ himself.
Awesome.